Right. And so here we have something that we've already talked about, hypothesis. And the reason I'm bringing this up again is to show you that even the hypothesis will always have an independent and a dependent variable. So remember, hypothesis is an if and then statement that predicts what's going to happen in an experiment. It's usually made after the research has been, so you got to do the pre research first, right? Ask some questions, do some research, and then you come up with your hypothesis. And it's very important that it is testable, right? It has to be written in a testable form. So, for example, here, if I increase the amount of water that the plant receives, then the plant will grow taller, right? So you should be able to identify the independent and the dependent variable in this example. So in this example right here, which is the independent variable? All right, which is the dependent variable? All right, after answering these questions, hopefully you all got this correct, but right here, the amount of water is going to be the independent variable, right? That's what's changing throughout the experiment. The experiment, and what is it that is affected by it? So in this case, the thing that is affected by it is the growth of the plant, right? That is what you're measuring here, is how tall the plants get. And remember, this dependent variable depends on the independent variable, right? So if this plant is one that loves water, then it should be that the more water you give it, the better the plant grows, right? So again, the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. The independent variable does not depend on the dependent variable, right? That's why it's independent. It doesn't depend on it. But the dependent does depend on the independent variable. A little confusing, but that's how it works. Right. So help writing a hypothesis for these right here, for these examples. So can reading small print cause a headache? Does the amount of iron in soil affect plant growth? Does skin cancer stem from sun exposure? So, an example that I'll give you for this first one, can reading small print cause headaches? And you don't have to write this down exactly, but it's just an example. So, if I read small print, then it will cause a headache, right? You don't have to follow that example precisely, but use it as an example to lead your example. So, go ahead and write some examples for these. All right, so now let's talk about the graphing part of independent variables and dependent variables, right? And how to do that. So, first of all, let's talk about the two types of graphs we're going to be looking at. The first is a bar graph, and this is used to compare amounts. So, when you're talking about a bar graph, this is basically what you're talking about here. This bar graph right here is just comparing the amount of people who prefer apples to oranges to bananas to kiwis to blueberries to grapes, right? That's what this is showing you right here. But something that is important to remember is that even in this graph right here, the simple graph, there is an independent variable and there is a dependent variable, right? And so we'll look at that in 1 second. Line graphs, they're used to show the change of one piece of information as it relates to another change. And so a line graph looks more like this, where you kind of see what's happening in one point in time from another point in time. And it compares those different points in time, right? So line graph here, bar graph here. What you need to remember though is that there are two axes, I guess, on this graph. There's an independent variable, which is a horizontal x-axis, and then there's a vertical, which is a y-axis. So remember, the horizontal plane is the x-axis. And that's where the independent variable is. I always remember that my independent is my x is independent, right? So my x is independent. That's just a little mnemonic, like something to help you to remember this. So x is independent. So whenever you have the x-axis, which is a horizontal one, that is where your independent variable goes. Your dependent variable will always be on the vertical y-axis. All right. So in this case, the independent variable for the bar graph is here on this horizontal one right here. So this right here, the horizontal axis, whoops, let me just draw the line through it right here. This is a horizontal axis. This right here is where we keep and let me try to write it off right here, independent variable, right? This is also right here, the x axis. And it's not very neat, but this is the x axis. Whoops. Right. Then over here in the vertical right here, this is going to be where your dependent variable goes. So this is the dependent variable, and this right here, and let me try to draw it a little bit nicer, y axis. All right, so remember, dependent variable is here on the vertical y axis, independent variable is here on the x axis. Independent variable horizontal, dependent variable vertical. right? Same thing here. Down here, the grade level would be the independent variable because this is the x-axis. So the independent variable always goes here on this horizontal axis, and the dependent variable here always goes on this vertical y-axis, right? So y, trying to make an arrow going up and down. And then this independent variable, again, is in this horizontal one at the very bottom, right? So dependent variable y-axis, independent variable x-axis. So if I ask you in this case, what is the dependent variable for this line graph? Well, then the dependent variable would be the MAT score, right? That's what you're measuring. And what is the independent variable for this graph? The independent variable, whoops, is here this grade level, and this grade level is a thing that is changing throughout, right? You're going from 7th to 8th to 9th to 10th, 11th, 12th grade, and in doing so, usually every time you go up a grade, it seems like the scores get higher, right? And that's usually what's happening. 7th, 72, at 8th year to 75, at 9th year at 81. It dips down right here. At 10th grade, it drops down to 80, but then it starts to go back up, right? So remember, dependent variable, independent variable. Right. So in this case right here, this is a graph, and here you have a table on the left. This red table right here is showing you the independent and the dependent variable. Just something to remember that's going to be so much easier for this assignment that's coming up. Whenever you have a table like this, whatever is in this first graph, the first column right here is going to be your independent variable. Whatever is in this second one right here is going to be the dependent variable. Right? So just remember, first column here, independent variable always. Second column is always going to be the dependent variable. All right. So remember, the independent variable always goes right here. So I'll put a line from here. It's always going to go in the x-axis. The dependent variable is always